He met her at the train station in Prague when he was looking for a platform for a train to Vienna. The girl was standing at the coffee stand, dressed in a long rust-colored coat, with a branch of dried rose hips in her hands. Her hair was braided into a braid, from which strands escaped, as if they had been specially pulled out by the wind. Mark wouldn't have noticed her then if it hadn't been for the seagulls. 3 white birds circled under the glass dome of the station, as if they had lost their way, and then suddenly swooped down to her feet. She laughed and tossed them crumbs from a paper bag, and then he noticed how her fingers were moving too fast, as if kneading invisible threads. "Are you on the 11:20 flight too?" she asked, turning around as if she knew he was watching. His eyes were the color of old amber, and there were reflections of something in them that he would later call too old for 20-year-olds. "Yes," Mark replied, confused by the fact that he was frozen with a suitcase in the middle of a stream of people. "Are you from Prague?" "From places that don't get mapped," she smiled as if it was a joke, but didn't explain. Her name was Alice. She said she worked as a restorer of old books, and it sounded plausible. Her backpack smelled of glue and parchment, and she had a copper-rimmed magnifying glass on her wrist. But on the train, when Mark poured water from a glass, she held her palm over the puddle, and the drops gathered back into the vessel, like a film of wax. He froze, but she just winked. Surface tension is an amazing thing. He nodded, even though they hadn't done that in their second year of engineering. The journey began by accident. Mark dropped out of school after his father's death, deciding to find himself in endless travel. Alice seemed to be always on the move. She knew roads that weren't in the navigator, a path through a Tuscan field of poppies leading to the house of an old woman selling dandelion wine, an alley in Istanbul where a blind musician played an instrument that looked like a whale's spine. People were drawn to her like plants to the light. Fishermen in a Croatian village left baskets of squid on her doorstep, and an old shepherd in the Alps gave her a bell that rang quieter than the wind. "Are you like a saint?" Mark joked when they spent the night in an abandoned chapel in Scotland. Alice was making a bonfire out of dry twigs, even though it had been raining for 3 days. "Saints wear halos, but I have," she ran her finger over his palm, "only splinters from the firewood." The fire started with the first click of the lighter, but it seemed to Mark that before that she had whispered something in a language similar to the whisper of coals. Doubts accumulated like dust in his pockets. In Barcelona, a street artist painted her portrait, and a day later the paint on the wall cracked, forming the letters Salvi, save. In Venice, she stopped a boatman who was racing their gondola under a low bridge, shouting, "Ferdinando, that's enough," even though they had never met. When Mark asked how she knew his name, Alice pointed to the sign on the paddle. "It says there. Can't you see?" There was no inscription. He started checking on her. In Paris, while she was sleeping, Mark opened her notebook with dried flowers, but instead of notes he found only drawings, mazes, stars, faces that changed when viewed from an angle. On one page was his face, and around it were wings, similar to those carved on tombstones. In the morning he asked, "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe that the threads break if you pull too hard," she replied, brewing tea from herbs that smell like smoke. Mark drank it, and the migraine that had plagued him for a week disappeared. The turning point happened in Edinburgh, in an underground bar, where Alice sang a ballad in a language she shouldn't have known. A drunken sailor grabbed her by the arm, demanding normal music, and suddenly fell down, curled up in pain in his stomach. She leaned over as if to help him, but Mark heard her hiss, "You'll remember my voice every time you lie." The next day, the sailor returned with apologies and a bouquet of thistles. "Are you a witch?" Mark blurted out as they walked along the canal. The mist clung to her hair like a spider's web. "If I were a witch," she stopped, "you'd be a toad by now. Or ashes." "Seriously. Yesterday. Yesterday he was poisoned by cheap whiskey, and I gave him charcoal pills. Everything is simple." But her voice faltered, and it was worse than any magic. They fell silent for 3 days, 3 moves, 3 nights in different beds. In Riga, under a downpour, Alice disappeared. Mark searched the streets for her, looked into the cafe where she liked coffee with cardamom, asked the vendors at the market. They told him, the one with eyes like autumn oaks. She went to the river. At Dagava's, he found only her scarf, wet from the rain, and a note, "I'm sorry. Some roads are better to walk alone." But a week later, in Tallinn, she returned. I stood on the doorstep of his hotel with black eyes and a box of chocolate truffles. I'm not a witch. But I'm not exactly ordinary. My family keeps secrets that are hard to carry. Are you ready for this? Mark wanted to say no. Instead, he kissed her, and she tasted like chocolate and pepper, sweet and dangerous. Since then, they have traveled differently. Alice showed him books where her name was mentioned 100 years ago, graves with her last name in different countries, people who bowed to her like old friends, calling her guardian. She taught him the language of herbs, where mint means careful and wormwood means truth. She said that magic was just a science that had been forgotten, and that her family was just a chain of those who remembered. I'm not immortal, she laughed when he asked. I just know how to change clothes. Like the seasons. One night in the Transylvanian forest, where Alice insisted on going for the mushrooms, Mark woke up to her screaming. She stood by the window, clutching the sill so that the wood cracked, and whispered, "They found us." The air smelled of sulfur, though there was no sign of a thunderstorm. They fled to the mountains of Switzerland, where Alice promised the last refuge, the laboratory of her ancestors, cut out of the rock. Mark followed her through a narrow tunnel lit by flickering fireflies in jars. The walls were covered with formulas, and human-like organs floated in glass flasks. It's not magic, she said, running her hand over the tube of blue liquid. Our DNA was studied here. To find a cure for this. She took off her glove, revealing her hand. The skin was moving as if worms were crawling under it. Mark recoiled. Mutation, Alice whispered. Cells regenerate endlessly, but sometimes they lose control. Like cancer. They slept on iron bunks, and at night he was awakened by her screams. Alice was thrashing around in a pool of blood, her own palm swollen, her fingers fused into a claw. Cut her off. She thrust the knife at him. Before it's too late. He couldn't. Instead, he injected her with a sedative from the first aid kit. My arm was fine this morning, but there were patches of skin on the floor. The pursuers found them a week later. This time it's with dogs and drones. Alice took Mark into a cave, the entrance to which looked like a crevice in a rock. It smelled of iodine and death. The virus is stored here, she pointed to the refrigerators with cracked glass. It was created to kill people like me. Why did you bring me here? Mark felt cold sweat trickle down his back. Because if they get it. Her voice broke, they'll use it against everyone. Even against you. They blew up the entrance, burying the laboratory under tons of rocks. But when Mark woke up in total darkness, Alice was already rummaging through his backpack. The flashlight picked out her face, her pupils narrowed into vertical slits, like a reptile's. Where's the first aid kit? Stop it, she hissed. What's wrong with you? Her fingernail dug into his neck. He hit her with a fire extinguisher. She fell down laughing. You're right. It's better to die than to become this. He found a syringe with a black liquid in her jacket pocket. The label read, the VX9 strain. Only for subjects with an anomaly. Is this for you? Mark held the syringe to her throat. For us, she smiled, and at that moment her jaw popped forward with a crunch. He injected the poison first. Her body was convulsing and foaming at the mouth. Then it was quiet. Mark leaned against the wall, gasping for air, but suddenly he heard a wheeze. "Thank you." Her fingers squeezed his ankle. "Now you're infected." He ran. Through underground rivers, through caves where fireflies went out at his approach. When he got to the surface, his hand was already itching. In the mirror of the lake, Mark saw the pupils slowly turning into slits. There was a second syringe in his pocket. Last. He did not use the second syringe. Instead, he went to Zurich, where Alice had once mentioned a doctor who could help. The city greeted him with rain and posters with her face. The police were looking for a terrorist for an explosion in the mountains. In an underground clinic hidden behind the facade of the morgue, a gray-haired man with glasses broke a needle trying to take blood from Mark. "Your DNA, it's changing too fast. Like hers." The scientist pointed to a screen where viruses were devouring cells, leaving black patterns. "You will die in a month. If you don't administer the antidote." Alice turned out to be the antidote. Her stem cells, her bone marrow. Mark demanded the truth. "Did you know that I would get infected?" "No. But I was hoping." The voice on the phone sounded muffled. "She was alive, trapped somewhere in the sewer tunnels. Come over. And bring the virus. We met at an abandoned subway station." Alice, wrapped in a transparent plastic suit, looked like a ghost. Her face was hidden by a filter mask. "The VX-9 virus is the key." She handed him a scalpel. "It doesn't kill the mutation. He's rewriting it. But for that, we need our DNA together." Mark understood too abstractly. When the blade plunged into her chest, and her blood mixed with his on the hilt, the alarm went off. People in chemical protection suits came out of the dark tunnels. "Thank you," said the leader, taking the bloody scalpel. "You have created the perfect weapon." Alice, bleeding profusely, whispered. "Explosives, in my spine. The countdown has already started." Mark ran, dragging her on his shoulders. The explosion threw them into the icy water of the canal. When he surfaced, his pursuers had left shreds of flesh on the walls. Alice was breathing, but her wound wasn't healing. The plastic suit was soaked in regeneration suppressant. "Why?" He shook her, tearing off her mask. Underneath it was the face of an old woman with her eyes. "Because you're the last one who remembered me." At the hospital where she was taken, doctors diagnosed her with terminal leukemia. "It's a miracle that she's still alive." They shook their heads. Mark sat by the window, looking at his hands, the spots on his skin disappearing and reappearing. In his pocket was a vial with a hybrid virus, stolen from the laboratory. She died at dawn. Her body disappeared from the morgue an hour later. On the same day, Mark received a package, a baby doll with a note saying, "Thank you for the DNA," and a photo of a newborn with amber eyes. He went out onto the roof, holding the bottle over the city. The wind smelled of sulfur. The choice was simple, to become a god or a gravedigger. Mark did not pour out the virus. Instead, he went to Prague railway station, where it all started. Standing at the coffee stand, he noticed the same flock of seagulls. One of them swooped down at his feet, holding a piece of paper in its beak. "Look for me where the stars are burning." The clue led him to an observatory in Chile. Alice was sitting in the office behind a pile of telescopes. Her face was smooth and unlined, but her eyes shone with the cold clarity of a predator. "You've learned to read the signs," she smiled, adjusting her thick, lensed glasses. "It's a pity, not before I raised you." It turned out that their first meeting was not accidental. Alice has been searching for decades for a carrier with a rare TP53 gene mutation, someone who can survive the hybrid virus. Mark, with his hereditary resistance to cancer, was the perfect candidate. "Did you think your father died of a heart attack?" She tossed a photograph on the table, a man in a lab coat, bound, with a needle in a vein. "He wanted to destroy my research." You were supposed to be my nemesis. Mark grabbed her by the throat, but his fingers found an invisible barrier, nano-armor under the skin. Don't touch Mom, a child's voice said. A boy about 7 years old with her amber eyes came out of the shadows. The gun was shaking in his hand, but the aim was accurate. Alice stood up, straightening her dress. Meet Mark II. He inherited your DNA and my malleability. In 20 years, he will change the world. And you, she touched his cheek, will be dead in 6 months. If you don't take the virus. She gave him a bottle of golden liquid. It's not a cure. This is evolution. Mark smashed the flask on the floor. The child fired, but the bullet missed. His hand was pulled away by the same invisible force that protected Alice. It's a pity, she sighed. But I have your sperm from the clinic in Zurich. Brainchild number 42 will be more perfect. When they disappeared, Mark found a room in the observatory with hundreds of test tubes. Each one has a date and coordinates. The last tube contained an embryo labeled Mark 42, launch, December 12, 2045. He sent the coordinates to Interpol, the media, and hospitals. A week later, governments began raiding secret labs. The news showed clone children with his face crying at gunpoint. Alice found him in Tibet, in a hermit's hut. She had aged 100 years in a month. You ruined everything, she coughed blood in her throat. Mark raised a cup of wormwood tea to her lips. Your greed did it. She died before she could whisper, the seeds have already been sown. A year later, Mark, whose skin now glowed in the dark, founded a foundation to help victims of genetic experiments. He checks the locks 3 times every night. And he laughs when tourists ask if he's seen a girl with eyes like amber. One day, a boy came to him with a photo of Alice and a test tube. Mom said you're going to teach me how to be human. Outside the window, seagulls beat against the glass, as if asking to be let home. The boy put the test tube on the table. The glass rang like a fragile promise. His eyes, amber and too old, studied Mark. She said you'd teach me to be afraid. Mark took Alice's photo. On the back, in a child's handwriting, was written, "Fear is the glue that holds the soul together." I don't know how to teach fear. Only doubt. They settled in an abandoned library, where books were moldy from dampness. Liam, as the boy called himself, collected quotes on the walls. Man is a memory that is afraid to forget itself, we are all failed gods. At night, Mark would find him sleeping among the disassembled clocks, the gears woven into his hair. Why don't you ask who I am? Liam once raised his head while soldering a microchip. Because I know. You're a question I don't have an answer to. Alice left Liam a legacy, a capsule with a virus in his spine and a key to a vault in Switzerland. When they broke down the door, there were thousands of tapes with clone voices inside. Liam inserted the first one. Day 47. Mark, 19, tried to laugh. The sound was like the creak of a rusty swing. Today he asked, if I die, will you raise me again? I didn't answer. Liam turned off the recording. His fingers were trembling. She called us, corrected drafts. You too? Mark showed him the scar on his chest, a mark from surgery when he cut out the tracking chip. We're all drafts. But some are written in invisible ink. They burned down the vault. In the flames, Liam suddenly screamed. I can feel them burning. And fell, clutching his head. His temperature jumped to 45, and his skin was covered with formulas, as if Alice had sewn a code into his DNA. At the hospital, the doctor said, exploding head syndrome. Hallucinations are caused by parasitic neurons. Mark knew the truth, it was a defense mechanism. Each clone felt the death of the brothers. Kill me, Liam whispered when consciousness returned. Otherwise I'll become her. Mark brought him a knife and a pistol. Choice is the only thing that distinguishes us from algorithms. Liam took the weapon apart, put it back together, and shot at the mirror. The shards fell at their feet, reflecting Alice's thousands of faces. "I'll choose fear," the boy said. But not hers. They left for the north, where the polar night blurred the boundaries between thought and deed. Liam learned to cry by playing recordings of children laughing over and over again. Mark was fishing, checking his pulse against the rhythm of the surf. Sometimes they argued. If you delete your TP53 gene, will you become a human? If you stop asking questions, will you become a machine? One day, on an ice floe, they found the body of a girl with the face of Iris, the first clone. In her hand was an envelope with coordinates and an apple seed. Liam sat him down by the cabin. "The tree will grow poisonous," Mark warned. "So we'll learn to eat poison," the boy replied. When spring came, and with it the ships with the black flags of the gene hunters, they did not flee. Liam came ashore with a white flag and a tube of ashes from burned records. "We are not artifacts. We are your reflection." The shot rang out when Mark was reading Alice's diary. On the last page, he found his childish drawing, a man breaking the DNA chain. At the bottom is the caption, "Freedom is a mutation that is not afraid of itself." Liam didn't come back. But an apple appeared on the threshold, red, with a leaf where it was written, "I chose the question." Mark took a bite of the fruit. The taste was reminiscent of the Prague railway station, seagulls and laughter, which never became real. He went out to the sea, where the waves licked the blood on the ice. A light twinkled in the distance, either a ship or a star dying in the atmosphere. "Next question," he said to the wind, and turned back. Mark returned to the library, where mold was already eating up the last words on the walls. I opened Liam's test tube and found a map of the starry sky and dried rose hips inside. The one from the branch line from Prague. He went out into the courtyard, where the apple tree had grown through the ice. The fruits hung black and icy. Taking a bite of one, Mark felt a burning sweetness, as if he were swallowing sunlight stolen from winter. The next day, an email arrived without a return address, a photo of Liam in front of the lab with the inscription, "Closed forever." On the back in a child's handwriting. "I erased their databases. But he left one seed. You'll understand. There's a tiny spoonful of DNA dust stuck to the corner of the envelope." Mark buried it under an apple tree. A year later, the tree bloomed with white flowers. Each petal glowed in the dark, just like his hands once did. Tourists whispered that this was a new kind of bioluminescence. Scientists took samples, but Mark was silent. One night, he sat under a tree with Alice's diary. On the last page, which I hadn't noticed before, it was written, "The only mutation that matters is the one that turns pain into hope." At dawn, he left, leaving the library door open. The wind turned over the empty pages of the books, and the seagulls dragged the diary towards the sea. They say there's a man walking around the world with a glowing scar on his chest. He hands out black apple seeds to the children and whispers, "Grow your question. The answers are just weeds." And the apple tree in the northern hut is still bearing fruit. Even in winter.